Welcome to Pilates is the Answer podcast, where you can discover the power of Pilates and how it can improve every aspect of your life. We are your hosts, Stacey Jernigan
and Pearl Dahmen, and we look forward to introducing and sharing all of the questions about which Pilates is the answer. Well, welcome back, Pilates is the Answer family. Stacey and I are together again. We're on Zoom today. We've been so busy. We haven't been able to meet in person for a little bit, but we're here today. We are going to talk a little bit about preparing to either teach classes or work in private sessions. Stacey, with all of her background, she's got a lot of different things that she does. I do have experience in both, but I feel like I'm still in the learning stages. So I always look to Stacey to share her words of wisdom. So I'm going to volley it right all over to you and start maybe with what are the challenges from your perspective, training instructors and your experience that you see just in general that instructors have about preparing, whether it's going to be teach a group or an individual.
Well, thank you for the nice introduction and always the support and encouraging words that you have to say about me. So I think it's really hard for instructors to maximize their time when they're going to sit down and do their class planning. For me, I know with a lot of my students, one of the things that I hear a lot is that they're spending sometimes hours a week with their class planning. So for me, that would be something I would love to help them with, and so that they can avoid spending that much time doing it. And it makes sense, though. I can relate to it because I remember leaving my training, which I had a very positive training experience. I loved it, but afterwards I was kind of like, okay, I've learned all these segments, right? I've learned how to do extension on the reformer, on the long box. I've learned how to do it on the mat. I've learned how to do it on the chair. How do I put all of this together in a way that flows well and where I don't really forget any of the key components, though all those spinal movements are so important and all that. And then in a way that feels almost like you're telling a story, from the beginning to the end, so that you're not having them, move through the class choppily or make it feel like they're moving equipment around a lot or going from the reformer to the mat, to the reformer, to the chair, to the reformer, back to the mat. Those types of things is what you want to avoid. And so what helped me in the beginning was, and it always makes me laugh when I think about this because my brother teases me all the time about being a nerd. And it's so true. I literally typed out into a separate document all the different ways that you could do, for example, arm work, right? So I was like, okay, you can do arms in hands in the straps, seated, facing away from the foot bar, facing towards the foot bar, facing to the side. You could do side kneeling, you can do it at the tower or the springboard. So I had to think about all of those ways that I could get it into one place in my brain. So I literally typed out a document where I could think about all the different ways that you could do that, because it just didn't make sense to me the way it was all divided into, the different manuals that were for each apparatus. That wasn't an easy way for me to process how to put it all together. So took all those different categories, all the different ways you could do bridging, all the different ways you could do the spinal movements. And then I literally took a clipboard. I printed all those out. And then I literally took a clipboard and spread all those documents out across my long dining room table. Took a clipboard and was like, okay, I'm going to take a couple from this category. I'm going to take a couple from this category. And I did that over and over and over until I felt like I had a couple of good, really solid class flows, if you will, to work from. And to this day, that really helped me categorize it all in my brain. And the way that I think about my class planning now is what are the key components that I'm always liking to begin my sessions with. And for everybody it's different. Some of us like to do a couple quick stretches, some of us a couple deep breaths, some of us a couple of pelvic tilts. What are you going to start with? Then are you going to go right into some footwork, which is what I usually prefer as sort of the warm up? if it's an equipment class. And then what am I going to lead into next based on who I'm teaching and what type of environment it is? Is it a small group setting? Is it a private? Is it a class? And I'll get more into that in a bit. And so I just think about that beginning piece of it. And then I think about the end piece of it. What am I going to end with? And those usually are about the same for me when I'm teaching. I typically like to be, pretty similar with what I'm beginning with and what I'm ending with, especially if it's a class setting, because then that way people kind of know what to expect. And, you just find what works in terms of a flowing well in a big group setting. And so then the middle, chunk of the class or the meat of the class, then I try to think about, okay, how am I going to get in everything in the middle where I make sure they move their spine in all directions. I'm always going to get in some planking in there. I personally like to intersperse some planks throughout as opposed to do like 3 or 4 back to back to back. That's just my personal style. So sometimes my planks are kind of transition exercises. For example, if we're doing some spinal movements, then I might throw a plank in between those as a transition before we go to the other side. So for example, if we're doing mermaid, we might do mermaid one side, maybe some other side lying type exercises to work the side glutes, then throw in a plank as the transition before we go to the other side. And I like to think of it in that way where things just flow together really well. In the beginning, when I first taught, I always taught in an order of like, okay, we just did something on this side. Now we got to go repeat it on the other side. And there's nothing wrong with that, but with my brain and, the way that I like things to flow well, I think it keeps people just in a little bit more in the moment of that mindfulness when they don't quite know what to expect, as opposed to if you do something on one side and then go right to the other side. And then also it gives some of the muscles a break, because when you're doing something like a lateral flexion type move or a side lying glute exercise, you're really working both sides. So then if you give those muscles a little bit of a break in between and throw in something, some type of different exercise, then it gives both sets of muscles a chance to really work evenly when you divide it up like that. And then of course, I'm always going to do something for the legs, some type of leg work. Sometimes that's the side lying. Sometimes it'll be even like some squats, not necessarily a true Pilates, but exercise, but a very functional exercise. And always going to do something for the arms and for the mid back, things that help with posture, things that help protect our shoulder joints. And then always some whole body exercises. Usually that's incorporated in planking, but not always. I love quadruped. I'm always going to try to throw in some balance challenges. And again, try to finish with something that people enjoy, maybe some feet in straps, maybe some stretching, something like that. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. But it took me a while to get there, to think of it as that sort of, telling a story, if that makes sense.
I like how you say telling a story. I know, I'm going into my 6th year of teaching now, and I know it was a good 2 years that I did a lot of planning. And then I finally went, this is enough. And I came up with a dozen flows, and I just rotate them,
Mhm.
and
Good.
about every other month I have a flow. And I did probably something similar to you. I figured out the different exercises. And then the story for me is, what am I focusing on? This is a bow class. This is a leg springs class, or this is a springs class. This one is, type of thing. And it was really helpful for me, because when I do a BOSU class, then anything that can be done in a BOSU happens in that class. And then I don't have that much transition or a lot of things moving around, and it just simplified the whole thing for me. And I've been doing that for a couple years now, and it makes it very easy to get ready, because at the beginning of the week, I say, what are my classes for the week? I pull those flows, I go through them. Do I follow them to a T? Probably not, because I see who's in the class, or maybe I picked up on a little detail in the last month or so, especially working with you. I've been picking up a lot of new details and adding those in and shuffling things around. And I keep telling myself, I need to revamp the whole system. It's a system for me. And I mean, I have tracker sheets. I can tell you the last time I've taught every one of them, where I taught it, the date, the whatever studio I did it at, and what time the class was. And so then I can look, and I went, oh, well, it's only been 2 weeks. I'm not teaching this one yet. This one was 2 months ago, I'll teach that one. So that way I try to keep it fresh for the members. But it's the routine, and the routine follows a format, just like you said, the beginning, the end, a little upper, a little lower, so it flows. And it just, not only does it save me a lot of time, but I can pull my flows, scan them, and then go teach. And I always keep them handy because there's that security blanket of knowing I can look at them. The first class of the week, I kind of check in with it. By the end of the week, I'm like doing it off the top of my head. But then it's going to be 2 months before I do it again. So I can't save it in my head. I got to go put it someplace to go get it again. So similar to what you do, but my style. I'm
Right.
the organizer, the lister kind of person.
You are so organized. I love that. And it's cool, like when you can get to the point where you're able to make those changes fly, like you're talking about. Because sometimes it is trial and error. You think, even if you practice it in your own body, which of course you should always do before you teach it, but it doesn't always have the same, time sequence, and it doesn't always have the same type of experience when you practice it yourself versus seeing it in real time, whether it's one person you're teaching to, 3 people, or 10 or 12 people. And so it is a lot of trial and error, but it's hard in the beginning when you're not really able to go off the grid like that. And I remember when I first started, I was so nervous that I would not follow exactly what I had written down. And somebody said to me one time, they have no idea what you have planned. So if you forget something, they're not going to know the difference. And I said, okay, yeah, you're right. I never thought about that. But to me, it was just, I wanted to make sure I was following everything that I'd worked so hard to plan. And then the other way I like to think of it is that for us, we kind of live and breathe those, teaching mechanisms. We're thinking about it often. And most of the time our clients are not. They typically, once they're out the door, they're typically not thinking about Pilates. I mean, they might think about something like, oh, I felt my core when I was leaning over to pick up something heavy or something like that. But they don't think about the order that we're teaching, or the variation that we picked, or how many pieces of apparatus or props we used. They don't think about those things. So my best advice to new instructors is to actually teach the same exact class flow, 15 to 20 times before you move on to changing it around. And not that it has to be the exact same order or the exact same props. You might throw in the ball one week and then the next week use the ring instead, or something like that. But really perfect it where you get in the perfect order that you really are comfortable with all the best transitions so that things flow together smoothly, with all the appropriate stretches interspersed in there based on what you're teaching and when they need a certain stretch and when they don't, how long those stretches need to be. And then of course the cueing, where you really would be able to, in your sleep, be able to cue what do they need to hear so that they, understand the purpose of why we're doing this exercise and what we're trying to accomplish with the exercise, and what should be moving and what should not be moving. And that, I think, is really important when you're teaching, because it's really important for our bodies to be able to stabilize certain parts while we're mobilizing other parts. And that way you get that perfect combination of utilizing the stabilizer muscles that are usually the weakest, even though I hate to use that word weak, but usually those are not the strongest muscles. It's usually those global mobilizer muscles like the quads. And so if you're able to get that cueing down where people can kind of check in and think, oh, wait, she's saying that I should feel glutes here and I don't, my quads are powering through. How do I change that? And so that's the hard part. Or I tease my teacher trainers sometimes and say, even my son could probably cue a full, class or session of telling you what to do. Right. But that action piece of it, or that, movement piece of it, of how to move your body or what to move, is really only one layer of teaching. It's that, again, what not to move, what's stable, what you're using to stabilize, what you're using to mobilize, what you shouldn't be using. So little things like, relaxing the shoulders or even relaxing the face. We tend to tense up when we're focused. reminding them of the connections in the body between the breath and the core. And if you're using the ball, reminding the connection between the inner thighs and the core. If you're having them push through their heels, reminding the connection between the heels and the glutes. Those are all those things that help us have that true mind body connection that Pilates tries to help us accomplish. But as you and I've talked about before, it's so easy to let your mind wander whenever you are taking a class or taking a session. And so as an instructor, it's our job to do as much as we can to create that type of mindful atmosphere. And it requires a lot of thoughtful words and thoughtful, powerful, phrases that we say that help bring people's attention back into their body, into, helping them execute the exercise the way that hoping for them to achieve.
We talked about a couple things, two things that you kind of splashed on that would be nice to go a little deeper into. One is the key components. And I'm going to add a little caveat to that. Are the key components the same whether you do a group or an individual? Or should you be deviating a little bit when you do one versus the other? So I kind of made that maybe 3 questions. I don't know, but I know you can handle it.
Yeah. So the way I think about it is, as our podcast a couple sessions ago was about the spinal movements, that given the, a class session, you try to incorporate all of those spinal movements, but then you're cueing any contraindications or modifications. When you're in a private setting, you know exactly what that person has going on with their body and what they quote should or quote should not do. So you take out any of those types of exercises that they, that are not appropriate for their body. And that's what's so great about it, is that you can tailor it, and if they have like a weaker, again, I hate that word, but weaker side of the body or more dominant side of the body, then you can do more reps on the side that you want to really focus on strengthening, so that they don't continue to create those imbalances. Well, in a class, you can't do that. You've got to keep everybody moving at the same pace and doing roughly the same number of reps. Sometimes in a class, I might say, let's do 4 to 6 here on this side, keep track of your number, and you're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. If you're doing either unilateral or a sideline or something like that. So then that way, they kind of are responsible for doing that exact same number on each side, but you don't have time to really delve into who should be doing more reps on one side versus the other, where you really can do that in a private setting. Again, like in a class setting, I might decide I'm always going to start with footwork and really focus on starting to cue some of the principles of Pilates while they're doing their footwork. Whereas if somebody comes in and they're in a lot of back pain, then I'm not going to lay them on their back right away. I'm going to think about some ways to get their spine moving first, so they can try to, begin to get that movement. They're really stiff, which a lot of times people are, and as we talked about before, a lot of times clients will end up in Pilates because of some type of injury or some type of chronic back event or something like that. And so then the goal is, how do I get them out of pain? And how do I get them moving so that I can kind of see in the body what they're struggling with and what they need? So it can be really challenging in a way. And I hear sometimes new instructors are often nervous or afraid to take on privates because it is a little bit more of a responsibility in terms of you thinking, what does this person need in that moment? So you're thinking much more on the spot versus having that class planning. But to me, it's really cool. I love to be able to do that. It challenges me for sure. But once you see them move, they kind of, it helps. They will help you be able to see what they need, because the system of exercises of Pilates speaks for itself, and you're able to, once someone starts moving and once they communicate with you and tell you, and you're talking with them the whole time, if they come in with back pain, so let's try to get you moving and tell me, are there positions where you feel any amount of relief, or are there positions that make it worse? And that's how you kind of troubleshoot and decide what they need. But then you still try to get in, a more comprehensive approach, just like you would in a class setting, where you're hitting all those components like we talked about, of upper body, lower body, side body, all of that. And then I always like to ask my privates, what is something you really like to do? And I want to make sure I include something they really like, and that way they enjoy it. It's not all just the hard work that Pilates can be, but also some of it that they enjoy. So yeah, it's fun. That's why I like doing a combination of both, because sometimes in a private, you can really get to understand somebody's body and really make those changes. Whereas in a class, it's really hard that you don't have that opportunity to be communicating with them and asking them, do you feel this in your glutes? And if you don't, then let's change it up. Let's do maybe a different position of your feet, maybe a different spring setting, maybe a different prop. Whereas sometimes you can throw out those suggestions in the class, and you want to try in a class to be able to speak to those things. So I know people that know me really well know that my favorite word when I'm teaching is maybe, maybe try this. And if that doesn't work for your body, if you don't feel your glutes more, then go back to this, maybe try the feet a little bit further apart if you're feeling your back. Maybe if you're in a bridge and your hamstrings are taking over or cramping, maybe try lowering your hips, and just offering those suggestions so that you are helping each individual in your class be responsible for knowing what their own body needs so that they can take those different variations. Then the tricky part is saying it in a way where people don't feel like you're just giving them a modification that's the easy way out. They want the modification that is still going to challenge them, but not in a way that makes it feel like, oh, this is less than. Because that's what I'll hear a lot in classes is when an instructor is trying to help accomplish the goal of offering those modifications, and they'll say, oh, if this is too challenging for you, then just do it this way. But that's not very encouraging, And it's also not super informative, because it's not even that it's challenging. We want it to be challenging no matter what the variation is. But what is that caveat of, if it's bothering your back, then how do we make those adjustments, right? Or if your shoulders are taking over, but we really want you to feel your underarm, shoulder stabilizer muscles, then what do we offer that's a different variation so that we feel it in the right areas of those, stabilizer muscles, and the joints aren't taking over. So it's a lot to think about. I'm not going to lie. People think like, when they, I don't know if people are this way with you, but I know when people are like, oh, you're a Pilates instructor, that's so cool. That must be so easy. You're just like working out all day, and, you're just helping people feel good. And I'm like, well, I'm not working out all day. I'm kind of just standing there telling someone else what to do.
Exactly.
A lot to think about. It's exhausting, to really try to make sure you do hit all those points of helping each person as much as you can, get the full experience of what you want.
Right.
So,
And it is difficult, because when you do a private, you see that person, and typically you only see that person, because I've done several too over the years. And they come back to you, and then you can build on what you've learned before. Whereas when you teach group classes, depending on how often you teach and where you teach, you may or may not see the same people over and over again. You may only see them once a week. They may drop into your class once and then not see them again for 3 weeks. So even if you try to make some situations that they can learn something about their body or connect, there's no way of knowing that they're taking that with them, because you can't come back and bring it all around. Listening to you sounds very much like privates is a fun way to go, to really go deep and understand Pilates. The plus side of classes is it's enjoyable to go out there and just make Pilates happen, see a lot of people get encouraged, know that you're reaching a lot of people that need the movements that wouldn't come into a private class or a private session type of thing.
Exactly.
So there's pluses for both of it. I see where you like doing both. I kind of stuck with one. I started doing privates, COVID hit. And so then that kind of stopped everything. And when things came back, situations changed, and I haven't gotten back to doing privates again. But I feel like, especially listening to some of the things that I've heard you say more recently, that it's something I need to pick up again here very soon, just to get that other feel of, Pilates, not just putting a session together and figuring out all the pieces, but then truly connecting it with the body, which is why a lot of the newer instructors, I mean, I was the same way. I was afraid of privates, because it's like, I don't know. I didn't know how to connect it to the person's body that was in front of me. I just knew how to tell them what to do.
Well, and sometimes also depending on the size of the studio that you teach, like a lot of times at in a bigger class setting studio, people that end up in privates are people that really maybe can't participate in a group class, right? So they have some specific injury, or they fall within some unique population or special population to where you do need to make a lot of modifications. So that's intimidating for new instructors because you think, okay, how am I going to make sure that I modify everything that they need to? But, for the most part, as long as you are communicating with them, and once they'll tell you if somebody has some type of diagnosis, they are the expert on it. They'll tell you, once they got that diagnosis, they're going to find out everything they can, and they'll tell you exactly, what is going on with their body and what they feel like they can and can't do, or what they've been advised by a medical professional, what they should and shouldn't do. And so you can kind of have that information. And then there's a lot of great material out there on even just within some of our training programs that we've gone through, and there's different workshops out there where you can become more educated on that topic so that you work together with that client to understand exactly, what they need. And the truth is, Pilates is a very safe and effective, modality of exercise, and that it had a therapy base to it when it first came about, that who Joseph Pilates was originally, working with, and how he came up with, the original pieces of
Used to
equipment
be
with
the
the
dance
hospital.
fixer, fixing dance bodies. Yeah, that was what
Right.
he
But
was
even
known
before
for.
that,
Mhm.
with
Well, yeah,
the
the
hospital strength.
soldiers. Yeah, yeah,
And so
the
that's the thing,
vets.
right, confirmed surgery. So that's the thing, is it has that therapy base to it. So as long as you are, listening to the person that you're teaching and keeping them in small ranges of motion and keeping their spine supported, if that's what they need, then they're okay. They're going to be safe. It's not like we're, asking them to do anything that's unsafe for their body. So that's, I think, times I like for instructors to feel encouraged by that and supported by that it's a safe modality of exercise, and then just communicate with the person and asking them how they feel. And you could be creative. If I have clients that have a lot of different contraindications, so maybe like vertigo and some neck issues and maybe a shoulder issue, and osteoporosis, or something else, and a lot of back pain, then I might offer them the wedge where they're supported and propped up, so that it eliminates that risk of them getting getting a vertigo spell, or them feeling their neck or their back. Or we might also use a neck pillow, sometimes both of those, and then you just kind of play around with different ways to support them while they can execute the exercises, and encouraging them that the goal is not end range of motion. The goal is for them to strengthen their core and all those stabilizer muscles. So that's the great thing about being able to be in a private setting with somebody that wants to get out of pain or wants to learn better movement patterns for their body, because some of the pain and injuries that happen do occur from misalignments in the body and imbalances in the body. So that's what I love about it, is that we can correct those. And in a private, you can be really specific about watching, for example, if they're doing, feet in straps, or some type of core exercise like a single leg stretch where you're replicating a walking type movement, and you can retrain the body to move in better alignment. And that's how you'll correct some of those imbalances and issues. That's the cool thing about it. But yeah, and I know it's intimidating. I know it's challenging. So I'm always willing to help people with that, overcoming that hurdle, because you don't have to have all the answers before they come in. You never will have all those answers until you see them moving and you troubleshoot with them. And that's kind of the cool thing about it. So maybe I'll volunteer myself for you can teach me a private, and we'll practice with each
There
other.
you go. Yes, that would be good. No, you what you've had to say makes me want to do it again. Like I said,
Okay.
COVID kind of stopped it. And then that fear came back.
Yeah.
I think there's a fear of hurting someone, doing the
Yeah.
wrong thing and hurting someone, because what you really want to do is help them. Of course, I've learned a lot of other things along the way, working in group classes. So I think I have a better understanding of the connection between Pilates and the body than I did a couple years ago too. So it's
Sure.
it's always an evolution. So to any,
Constant learning process.
yes. So for brand new instructors or fairly new instructors, there's a lot of things to think about. But no, if you just keep doing it, if you just a little bit more, add a little bit here, in time, you can become as knowledgeable as Stacey is and become a master trainer.
There
So
you go.
yeah, maybe one of these days I'll get down that path too.
You're on your way for sure.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it. So do you have any last advice for newer instructors or even experienced instructors like myself as far as preparing a class?
I think the main thing is, just knowing the purpose of what you're teaching, because I think that is what is difficult when, especially like you mentioned earlier, when someone comes to your class and they also are taking classes from other instructors and they say, oh, well, she cued us to do it this way, or she cued us to do it this way. But you don't ever know what the other instructor, why they picked that variation. They probably had a completely different purpose, and that's why they chose that. So that's what's important for you to convey when you're teaching in a group setting where you don't have time to explain as much as you do in a one-on-one setting. In a class setting, you want to give cues that speak to that purpose and that speak to, why we're doing that exercise. So you should be feeling this in such and such, and then giving those little caveats of, if you feel your back, do this, or if you feel your, shoulders or your neck taking over, do this. And that, I think, is what is going to make the most difference when someone is just going through the motions of what you're asking them to do or telling them to do. Giving those, like I mentioned earlier, those action cues are really just that first level, that first piece of it. And then we need to go deeper and tell them the purpose, why they're doing it, what we want them to be feeling, and ways to make it a little bit more supported if something is taking over that we don't want to, or ways to make it more advanced as well, and encouraging friendly ways of saying that, so that someone who really shouldn't take a more advanced variation won't be tempted to. So it is tricky to say those things, in a way where people know that, which variation is best for them. So I think that's important. It's really important to speak to the purpose. It's important to think about moving the spine in all those 4 healthy directions that we mentioned a couple podcasts ago. And then just thinking about moving in all planes of motion. You're already going to move your spine in all planes of motion if you do those 4 spinal movements, but we want to move the arms in all planes of motion, move the legs in all planes of motion, because all day long, we're moving in front of the body. Our arms are in front of us, our legs are in front of us. So we know people can come in and do that. We know that front of the body is usually stronger. So we need to work the side body and the posterior chain. So you want to make it a really comprehensive approach for the whole body, and giving those cues to help them understand, what we're doing, where we're feeling it, and thinking about when it's appropriate to throw in just a couple stretches. Doesn't have to be anything lengthy, but just a few little stretches. If you teach a lot of intense bridge work, for example, then they might need some hamstring stretches, or, a stretch for the back if you've done those back to back. And, we have to think about those body parts that tend to take over and that tend to compensate, and give those people, that are feeling it in those places a little bit of a breather. And you also want to think about ways to tell that, nice story, start it in a way that sets the pace and the tone for the class, and then a nice way of finishing, whatever your signature way is of finishing. And then throughout, just keeping those transitions flowing well, where it doesn't feel choppy, where it seems really smooth, and making sure that you're incorporating lots of those encouraging power phrases of helping them understand, the goal of what we're doing. So I hope that makes sense and I didn't forget anything.
We hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for tuning in. For more information, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Pilates is the Answer, and on the web at pilatesistheanswer.com.
Feel free to message us with questions for which you are searching the answer. We would love for you to follow our podcast, leave a kind review, and lots of stars.